I'm Richard Fortey. I'm president of the Fungus Survey of Oxfordshire. I'm talking about fungi today. Normally we have a live event here in the Harcourt Arboretum of Oxford University, where we take people round to look for fungi growing where they like to grow, underneath trees and in the grass around the premises here. But we can't do that this year. But nonetheless, it's quite possible for us to look at a variety of things that have come up, which we've been able to collect in complete COVID safety over the last day or two. So welcome to a virtual fungus foray. I'm Richard Fortey. I'm president of the Oxfordshire Fungus Survey, and today I'm going to talk about the kind of mushrooms that are coming up in our woods at this time of the year in September and October. This is our favourite time of year if you're interested in mushrooms, because there are more species now than at any other time in the year. So what I've got in the table in front of me are a whole selection of just some of the wonderful species that we've been able to find in the last few days. And I'll start with everybody's idea of a mushroom, the fly agaric. It's the one with the red cap and the white spots, you know, the one that gnomes often sit on top of in fairy stories. It has, curiously, its spots are actually movable. If I scrape them, I can just move them off like this. They're loose, and the mushroom looks quite different when it's young. It's a little sort of compact ball. There it is, halfway grown with a basal bulb. And when it's fully grown, it looks like this. And you'll notice it's got a nice little dangling ring around the stem. And the other thing we always look for if you're a mushroom person is the colour of the gills, which you'll see are white. And so that gives it a whole lot of characters that tell us that it belongs to a mushroom genus, technically Amanita. Which includes some of our most beautiful and elegant woodland mushrooms. Many of them are poisonous. This one, you don't want to eat this one. Apparently, the Siberian warriors used to eat it to get into sort of high frenzy before they went into battle. But it's definitely not to be recommended. Now, if that one's poisonous, which it is, the one I want to show you, because it's the most poisonous mushroom known to humankind, is this one. It's a relative of the fly agaric, and can you see it comes from a bag at the base of the stem here. It actually arises from this little bag and pushes up before the cap expands. The cap is a sort of olive green colour. Of course, I always think it's rather sinister, but then I would, because it's so poisonous. This is known, doesn't mince its words, as the death cap. Now, if I was to go home and cook that up and ingest it, I would probably be doomed. Very few people have survived eating a death cap. And it's been responsible for more fatalities than any other mushroom. And it's a relation of the fly agaric. And it's not uncommon. I must have seen 50 or 60 of them this year. It's been a particularly good year for death caps. So that's the one to beware of at all costs. It has a relative, the false death cap. Here it is. And you can see if you look at the false death cap that the cap colour is altogether paler. But again, you've got white gills on the underside. Here we are, white gills. And this one doesn't have a bag like that at the base of the stem, but it does have a very bulbous base to the stem, you can probably see there. And these are very common in our woods. And the reason they're found in the woods is because they are associated very closely with trees. Fungi and trees, many types of trees, in fact all types of trees, are bound together in an association with the fungi and the trees called mycorrhiza. The living part of the fungus, the so-called mycelium, travels through the soil in search of nutrients. And at some point in the past, those of Amanita became very closely associated with tree roots of oak and beech and the like. The mushroom acquires sugars from the tree, whereas the tree acquires scavenged things like phosphorus that the mushroom's very good at gathering from the soil via its mycelium, so both then benefit. This association has become very, very important to understanding how our woods work and continue. Some of these are very rare species. Some mushrooms are very common, others are extremely rare, and perhaps the rarest one on the table here in front of me is this giant, which is another Amanita species. Amanita strabiliformis is exceedingly rare. I've sometimes gone for years without seeing it, and this year it's been particularly good for it, maybe because of the hot weather, I don't know. But I don't suppose anybody knows how edible this one is, but it's certainly not worth trying because it belongs to the same group as the deadly poisonous ones. It's very robust, and you can see if on the underside how the ring is just detaching from the edge of the cap, and it's becoming dangly down here. You can probably see that, it's like a skirt. Now, not all mushrooms have a ring. It's a very important feature. If you see it, that helps you to say what species you've got. So once you've started looking at mushrooms carefully, you see more and more important features, and that helps you to identify them. When you're walking through the woods, you'll often see most brilliantly coloured mushrooms pushing up through the leaf litter. These too are associated very closely with the trees in mycorrhizal associations, and they can be every colour of the rainbow. Well, I've got a selection in front of me which is, well, certainly ranges through bright scarlet to yellow to, well, dark green and pink. These beautiful mushrooms are known together as the BRITTLEGILLS. Well, the gills of the mushroom, of course, are on the underside. And there they are. And the business end of mushrooms is done on the gills. This is where the spores, oh, there's our friend the beetle, coming up over the top. This is where the spores are produced, on the gills, in their millions. So the mushroom is doing a job when it comes up, pushing through the soil, opens out like an umbrella, and then sheds millions of spores, which of course are how it reproduces and spreads from tree to tree. The spores are just a few thousandths of a millimetre long in most mushrooms, far too small for the eye to see, although if you leave a mushroom overnight on a plate or on a piece of paper, you'll wake up in the morning and find sometimes a nice little spore print left by the spores dropping off the gills during the night. Well, the BRITTLEGILLS are called the BRITTLEGILLS because if I stroke them with my finger, as I've just done, you'll see the gills fall out. They're brittle. So it's a good common name for this particular group of mushrooms, which are among the most characteristic of our woodlands and the most important for our trees. There are, in this group of mushrooms, poisonous ones and indeed edible ones. But the recognition of these fungi is actually rather difficult, despite their bright colours. And I would never, ever recommend anybody who wasn't a really serious expert to think of the BRITTLEGILLS as a possible edible material. They are, as I say, extremely abundant, and some have very peculiar characteristics. The one I'm holding, for example, starts off quite pale coloured, almost white, and as time passes it gets darker and darker. The gills here are still white or pale, as you can see, but the stem you can probably see is going very, very dark, and there's one that's got a little further. So they finish up completely black. So this is a weird thing about mushrooms. The same species can actually look quite different at a different stage of its growth. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why people find them rather hard to identify. Oh look, we've got a harvest man now. Well, this is extremely rustic. When you're a mushroom expert, one of the things you have to do is actually taste a little tiny bit of the BRITTLEGILL. You must never swallow it like this. Nibble it. Don't do this at home. then you spit it out. And because some of the species are very peppery, and others are sort of mild and nutty tasting. That was rather a peppery one. Anyway, these are among the most attractive and important of the woodland mushrooms we can find. And this year, 2020, has been particularly good for them. I've probably got 15 different species of this one type of mushroom on the table in front of me. There are in total well over 100 different kinds. And one of the things that people don't realise about mushrooms is just how many species there are. Many of them quite distinctive, but some of them really rather hard to identify. There's a relative of the brittle-gill with an even more peculiar characteristic. These are the milky cap mushrooms. A lot of them shaped like little funnels, and the one characteristic of this group of mushrooms is the gills sort of run down the stem. You can probably see that. They turn down the stem rather than running across and meeting the stem at right angles. So they become little funnel-shaped things. But the real giveaway for this particular mushroom is that when you cut the flesh or damage the gills, that they exude, I hope you can see this, a milk. You see milky drops coming out? Oh yes, that's obliging very well. So that's the milk that gives them their name, milky cap. And again, there are lots of different species of these milky caps. Many of them associated with trees. This I found underneath beech woods, and they're probably in a mycorrhizal association with the beech trees. This one is called the ugly milk cap, and you can probably see why. It's a really rather unpleasant sort of yucky green colour. Let's see if we can make it bleed its latex. It's been rather dry, so they're not quite as prolific as that one I've just shown you. Yes, where I've broken the flesh, you can probably see the milk oozing out. I don't know if you can. Yes, you can. It's just coming along the edge there. This is probably the commonest milk cap, which is associated with beech trees. And this has a funny property that the milk actually changes colour when it's exposed to the air. This sort of turns slowly a sort of yucky green colour. You can see the milk coming out again. When it's exposed to the air, it will change colour. And there are some milk mushrooms where the milk changes from white to green, and there are others where it changes from white to gold, and others where it changes from white to violet. So these different species are identified by their different milk reactions. Now you can imagine how many spores are produced on that particular. Look at the number of gills, and each gill is lined with spore-bearing organs. So you can imagine the millions and millions of spores produced by these mushrooms. Anyway, they serve to brighten up the forest floor in the autumn, particularly. The mushrooms I've shown you so far are those that have an active relationship with trees, but of course a lot of mushrooms aren't living with trees or indeed with any vegetation. They're breaking it down when it dies, and some of them are even the agents of death. The ones I'm looking at now are fungi that grow on wood. Almost the commonest mushroom in Britain probably is this chap. Often bright sulphur yellow, and the gills look greenish. Hard to capture on the camera, but you might manage it later. This is the sulphur tuft, which you can often find in hundreds around a dead stump. This is not attacking the tree, it's just breaking it down. And if it wasn't for the action of mushrooms like sulphur tuft, our woods, indeed perhaps the world at large, would clog up with undigested material. These are doing a vital job returning nutrients to the soil and breaking down wood. fungi have a fantastic chemical armory that can attack things like lignin and cellulose in wood in order to help break it down. And they help other things like bacteria to do their job as well. So you can't overestimate how important these are in nature. They're making the soil, if you like. Sometimes, though, if that's our friend, they can turn another face towards us and become rather deadly parasites. And this is one of the ones that the gardeners don't wish to see in their gardens at all. This is honey fungus. Looks fairly innocuous, doesn't it? You can see on this one that the cap hasn't really expanded, so it's like our baby fly agaric, but you can see it's forming a collar, a ring on the stem again here, quite fibrous. And these still have the ring connected to the edge of the cap. That's a very diagnostic feature of this particular fungus. It's a major killer of trees, and it can travel from tree to tree via some black mycelial cords that move it around the place. When it's killed a tree, usually if you wait a little bit, these mushrooms will come up in great profusion to spread the spores still further. It has the distinction, a species related to this, has the distinction of being the largest organism on Earth. In Oregon, they discover that one particular clone of honey fungus has spread from tree to tree to tree, and its combined weight, probably out of the mycelium, the stuff that makes it up, probably outweighs that of a blue whale. So it's a record breaker. Anyway, this is fungal foe. Not quite so dangerous a parasite is this, the shaggy scaly cap. Very well known because its cap is covered with fine scales, but unlike those of the fly agaric, these cannot be wiped off. They're an integral part of the cap. This often grows in huge clusters at the foot of still living trees. It's our beetle friend again, is it? Look. It's very sorry, that was a distraction. Yes, so this is another guild fungus that attacks trees, and we'll see more examples that don't have gills, that belong to different groups of fungus. So fungi are our friends mostly, but a few have become our enemies, or at least the enemies of trees on which we might depend. But by far the majority are our friends. Well, all the fungi we've looked at so far bear their spores on gills. But there are fungi that bear their spores in different ways. And we're now going to look at the most important group of fungi that do that, so-called boletes, pored fungi. Now, here's a lovely specimen. And there's my friend the beetle. This particular mushroom, you can see that on the underside of the cap, where we saw gills before, here we've got a kind of sponge. Actually, it's a series of tubes with little pores. And the spores are still born on the underside of the cap, but they're born inside the tubes. So it's a completely different looking way of dispersing spores, and of course this forms a completely different, separate group of fleshy fungi. From the table point of view, they include some of the most delicious edible fungi. The famous cep of French cooking, porcini of Italian cooking, are fungi of this kind, and they are truly delicious and much sought after. And I have to add that in our forests now, places like Epping Forest and the New Forest, they've introduced a ban in picking these very good edible fungi, because some people pick to excess. I've always thought that my own view is that you can pick for your own table, but the commercial interest in these is now such that it's been quite damaging probably to the overall history of these fungi. So pores on the underside, some of them have very interesting properties. This one, for example, has flesh that changes colour as soon as it's exposed to the air. And I'm going to demonstrate this if I can, taking my trusty penknife. The flesh, when it's first cut, is yellow, and you can see within a few seconds it changes from yellow to blue. It's quite dramatic. And this is just one example we happen to have on the table of fungi that do this. There are quite a few that do it in different ways. But if you're identifying the mushrooms with pores, this particular feature is rather an important one, because they do it to different degrees, and some don't do it at all. And you see, it's gone practically indigo, hasn't it? It's wonderful. I'm just going to have a look at this under my hand lens to see which species I think it is. Oh yes, I think so. This is one of those fungi that eventually all turns dark blue. What this chemical reaction if it's for anything, is a mystery. It doesn't seem to confer particular protection against the fungi from being eaten by things. In fact, fungi don't seem to mind being eaten by things. And if you look inside the stem I've just cut through, you'll see a large hole, which is my friendly maggot that will eventually produce a fungus fly. Now, I've said already that there are many, many species of fungi, so there are many, many species of fungus gnat or fly. Not as many as there are fungi. But I have done experiments on relatively small mushrooms like that, can produce 50 or so flies when they decay. Now that's 50 edible flies for an insectivore. So fungi are not only giving human food, not only performing a useful role in the soil, vital role in the soil, but they're also raising flies which can provide food for some of our more delicate and indeed sometimes threatened species of birds and other animals too. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of fungi in the habitat. Let's have a look at this one. Yeah, this one, just to demonstrate, is another. It's lost its stem already. I think the slugs have had it. In fact, you can probably see if you look at it. When I turn that in the light, can you see it glistening? That's Mr. Slugs. And slugs love boletes in particular, these pored fungi. They try and get to the crop first and very often succeed. But I'm just going to demonstrate this one. You can see in the cap there, lots of little holes. That's where the fungus gnats are growing up. But unlike the last one I cut through, the flesh isn't changing. It's completely unchanged when I expose the air. And I hope you can see that the little tubes there on either side where we had gills on the normal mushroom. You can see these little tubes where the spores are being born on these boletes. A very important group of rather beautiful fungi, and some of them very strictly attached to one species of tree or another. Some are only found under conifers, some are only found under broadleaf trees, and some are only found under oaks and so on, that usually being a reflection of their association of their roots with the fungus. Well, there are still other ways of looking after your spores or dispersing your spores, and here is one to show you the coral fungus. Really beautiful. On this, well, it does really look like a coral, and the spores, remember, this is just the spore producing part of the fungus. The rest of it is underground as mycelium and mycelial networks. The spores on this one are born on the surface of these coral-like branches. Again, they're produced in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And there are a whole lot of species of these extraordinarily lovely coral fungi. Oh, that's looking a bit sad, I think. It's probably too sad to talk to. That's one that grows in grass. It's about the only thing we found growing in grass today. Well, we've seen fungi that produce spores on gills, those that produce spores inside tubes, those that have them on a coral-like growth, but we still haven't come to an end to it. There's some that produce their spores inside an enclosed sac, puffballs and their relatives. And I've got a small selection of those in front of me here. Possibly the earth balls might be the commonest, and these are, that's a youngish one. You'll see these growing by forest paths, often in abundance, under trees. They begin quite hard. This one's quite hard to squeeze. At this stage, I'll cut it open again. Whoops. You'll see that even then, the interior has gone black. That's where the spores are being produced. When they're ripe, they look a bit like this. Not quite so attractive, really. And when they're really ready to go, the outer part begins to decay and the spores get distributed just like smoke. That was good, wasn't it? And they get caught up by the breezes and carried off to form a new fruit body or form the mycelium that will eventually give rise to a new fruit body. Earth balls and their relatives, the puffballs, relatively common, inedible mostly. In fact, these very young ones have been used as fake truffles. You know, truffles are the most expensive foodstuff known to man. I think the white truffle outweighs caviar for expense. So if you can imitate one, you make money. But it's quite illegal, of course. Well, one group of these, I haven't unfortunately got an adult one here. One group of these are the stinkhorns, which, as it were, start like this, a sphere, and from out of the sphere grows a stalk which carries on top of it a really smelly substance which contains the spores, which is adored by flies who then spread the fungus elsewhere. All I found today is a stinkhorn egg, which looks, of course, just like a puffball, and it is effectively a puffball, but inside lurking, you'll see a little white rod surrounded by green stuff. And the green stuff includes the spores, and the white rod expands upwards to form the stinkhorn. So they're quite a varied group. And my favourite, my friend the beetle is coming to have a look, my absolute favourite member of the group are the earth stars, which are very appropriately named, as you see, because they look like little stars that come out of the ground. They start enclosed, looking a bit like an earth ball, but as they mature, the rays of the star open backwards and the spore-bearing part gets lifted up on a little stalk. And I think, no, this is not quite mature. Oh yes, you can't quite see it. I can see it from where I am. The spores come out of a little mouth at the top. There are a dozen or so species of earth star in this country, but if you're a mycologist and you're leading a foray into the woods, it's always a particular thrill to find an earth star. And during the time our fungus survey of Oxfordshire's been running, we've made a number of discoveries of earth stars, very rare ones, which are the first time for our whole county. So one of the thrilling things about doing fungi is that every year, without exception, you see something you've never seen before, and in your own backyard, or at least on your own doorstep. So you don't have to travel, as you would if you're a bird watcher, to Paraguay to see a species you haven't seen before. You might find it growing in your local children's park. Anyway, these are the GASTEROMYCETES, the puffballs and their allies. Well, so far, what we've looked at are mushrooms that come broadly out of the ground or grow around stumps. There are much more robust fungi, the bracket fungi, that actually come out of the trunks of trees more or less directly, or fallen logs. They can achieve a considerable size. They're usually quite tough, and they too, most of them anyway, bear their spores in from pores. It may not be very obvious because these pores are frequently extremely small, but on the undersurface of this you should see very, very tiny pores which produce the spores. So this one bracket would again produce millions, if not billions, of spores. Somebody reckoned that one large fungus can produce more spores than there are known stars in the universe. Well, all that means, of course, is that the viability of an individual spore is extremely low. You need vast numbers of spores to ensure the survival of your species. Well, these particular tough brackets are again very important for breaking down wood into its component parts. Again, a few of them are gamekeepers turned poachers and actually kill the trees that they live on, but many more actually perform a useful purpose in breaking down the wood. Some are very specific to one particular tree. This, for example, is the birch polypore, which is Fomitopsis speculinus, which is specific to birch trees and won't grow on anything else, or at least very, very rarely. Others are much more general. They'll grow on any broadleaf trees or any conifer trees, but there are very few that grow on both broadleaves and conifers, so they're a bit choosy. That's about as big as they get. The largest British fungus is called Meropilus giganteus, and that's far too big. I've seen one today, which would have gone all the way across this table, far too big to bring along. Most of them are quite corky, like this. A few are softish. This rather odd-looking thing you'll see is the beefsteak fungus, which grows almost entirely on oak. And indeed, it looks uncannily like a piece of fresh meat from the butcher's. It's glistening. We had to cut one off, a bit off it off. It's glistening in a rather sinister way here. And the beefsteak fungus, reputedly edible, though I wouldn't try it myself. It looks rather unpleasant. That used to be thought as a parasite, and people thought it was doing the tree some damage. It's now realized that oaks, at a certain point in their life, and they live a long time, after several hundred years, the heartwood, which is not living, gets consumed by the beefsteak fungus. So those very old oaks you've seen, that are all hollowed out in the middle, one of the agents of that is this activity of this fungus. And it doesn't kill the tree. In fact, it makes the tree stronger. When they're a hollow tube, they can live for another 500 years sometimes. So the dear old beefsteak fungus is actually doing the tree a service, not killing it. Possibly the commonest of these brackets is, where are we? Yes, this one here, or this one here, which is given the common name of turkey tail, which I think is rather a good name for it. Not all fungus names make sense, but the turkey tail is a very good name for this one, because it's got a white edge and very dark inner part, and forms a big fan like that too. It does look actually a little bit like a turkey spreading its tail. You'll find this one sometimes in tiers, covering large areas of wood. This is another one. Large areas of wood, and gradually breaking it down. And it's got a slightly furry upper surface, so it's a very important wood breaker downer, and you can find it, it's one of the few fungi you can find almost at any time of the year. Most fungi seem to prefer to fruit in autumn, which is, we always think of us mycologists as the fungus season. But that's not entirely true. Some fruit all year and some favour spring. for reasons that are not altogether understood. Well, so far, all the fungi we've had a look at, fruit bodies, have been of one particular kind of fungus. We call one particular kind of fungus called basidiomycetes. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it means is that these bear their spores, however, whether in pores or on gills or on coral-like growths, they bear their spores on a special cell which is exposed to the air. So that the breeze can just waft the spores away and distribute them. But there's another great group, huge group of fungi, which don't do that. They bear their spores instead in little sacs called an ascus, 8 of them, or nearly always 8 of them, in a little sac, and when they're ripe, the sac just spurts out the spores, or releases them sometimes more passively, into the air where they get carried away in turn. These are called ASCOMYCETES, a bit of a mouthful again, but it just means fungi that bear their spores in asci. And many of them are tiny, which is why they're not on this big table with the big fungi. But some of them get to quite a decent size, and I've got a few examples here that we found in the woods. Perhaps I should start with this one. We hear a lot about ash dieback recently. That's caused by one of these fungi, but a very small one. When the ash has died, it often gets colonized by this particular black fungus, rock hard at this moment, which are known as crab balls, or sometimes King Alfred's cakes, because they look like cakes that have been burned, I guess. Crab balls, because I think people thought that if they put them under their pillow, it might help cure the crabs. I think if I was sleeping under a pillow with bullets underneath, I'd wake up with the crabs. But this favours growing on ash, so although it's one tiny little ascomycete that's killing the ash, another one is benefiting from the dead ash. You can't see it, but when they're fertile, the whole surface is covered with these tiny, or just under the surface, is covered with a tiny layer of tiny flasks that are releasing spores to spread the crab balls around. Much easier to see and much more attractive in a way, the hare's ear. This is related to a delicious edible fungus called the morel, and many of the relatives of this fungus actually fruit in the spring rather than the autumn. But this is an autumnal one, quite large, growing just straight out of the leaf litter. And you might say, well, where are the spores born on this one? And the answer is on the inside of those sort of cups, split cups that look a bit like ears, hence the name. If you're really lucky, you can just puff it like this. And a cloud of spores, no, not doing it today, a cloud of spores will be released into the atmosphere because they're in little flasks that coordinate when they release if there's a breeze blowing on them, which my breath was trying to imitate. These are waxy cups, of which there are many, many species. Some of them colonizing habitats like dung, for example, where they do a very useful job breaking the dung and returning it to the soil. But you can find them lined up on sticks, and occasionally, again, they become parasites, ash dieback being one good example, usually because the tree that they're parasitizing or colonizing hasn't got a natural defense to this fungus because it's come in from somewhere else. I believe that's true of ash dieback. But many other so-called plant diseases are actually done by man because we brought the fungus from some other part of the world into the habitat. But these are breaking down the leaf litter in like fashion to so many of the gilled fungi. Really rather lovely things with its peach colour. Much less lovely, probably, and I think the label's probably got it right, yes, dead man's fingers grow on wood and you can probably see them sticking up there, I hope, black, of which there are several different kinds. This again is an ascomycete which bears the asci, the little flasks, inside special vessels all up and down the side of that little black fruit body. And these are exclusively colonizers of dead wood, so again they're part of the great army of fungi that help return wood in the long term back to the soil. And how long, you might ask, is long term? Well, it depends on the species of tree. Leaves can be reduced to leaf mold in a year. Some woods, like cherry wood, quite soft, and you can watch them in a dozen years or so returning to a crumbly condition. Others, like oak trees, full of tannin, can take, well, I've seen one particular oak tree which doesn't seem to have changed much in over 40 years. They break down extremely slowly, but the only thing that can do it are our friends the fungi in all their variety.